that things are beautiful now. So be present with the beauty that's here.
Today in the Days of Change podcast, I have a real rock star with me. We will talk about the power of improvisation and how to leverage that power for saving the world and changing organizations. I have a hunch that this episode might be a hilarious one. You will find all other episodes and show notes on our website, which is changedays.com/podcast, and my name is Holger Nauheimer. My guest today is Belina Raffy. At that point, I would usually say where this person comes from, but in the case of Belina, that's nearly impossible. Belina is part American, part French, and she has lived in Mexico, Canada, and the UK, and what have you, and she has traveled the world. Today, she joins us from Berlin, where she has found a temporary residence some years ago. In an earlier life, Belina worked for a big bank in London and New York, where she saw a bunch of people burning out. That obviously had an impact on her. She did an MBA at Cranfield, and somehow later she got into applied improv. I don't want to say more at that point because the story of her life is worth to tell, and I want to spend some good time on that. A few years ago, Belina founded her company, which is called Mafic. The first words that you will read when you go to her website are, "Let's save the world together." She is a person of its own, and I have seen her repeatedly to rock the crowds with her charisma, but also the deep wisdom which she shares in her courses and seminars. She currently writes her first book, which will be called Using Improv to Save the World. And I had the chance to look at the manuscript, and if we cover only 10% of the stories in that book, we will have a whole day to talk. Howdy, Belina, bonjour. I really couldn't wait to having this chance for an entertaining hour with you.
Hello, it's a real honor to be here. Thank you, Holger.
Belina, tell us a well-kept secret about yourself, something few people know. I promise our listeners can keep a secret.
Let's see. So I can do an incredibly authentic baby cry. Would you like to hear it?
Yeah. Wow, that's hilarious. Thank you. As I said in my introduction, you worked in a bank, yes, which is quite different from the job you're doing now. Talk about the moment that changed the path of your life.
I worked for this bank both in the UK and in New York. And New York was particularly stressful. I had a manager who was trying to make it in the man's world, but that meant she was sort of infinitely less empathetic to prove that she was man enough to be the senior manager that she was, which made it very difficult. As a way to just connect with people and laugh, I took my first improv class and my first stand-up class in 1996. And what was interesting for me is with the improv class, my job in New York was both highly stressful and highly boring. It was one of those. And there was something about the improv that made my job feel a bit easier. Later, I would come to understand that it was about what we were doing all the time was engaging with complex adaptive systems. And the thing that was stressful about it is we were pretending they were linear. So I'm still happy that I left the bank so we don't have to pretend anymore. But the thing about improv and feeling in ease, but not even making the bridge yet, was the seed that it planted for later on.
So you did this course in improv. When was that?
1996. Well, see, then I came back to the UK and worked for a fabulous boss, but in a very stressful back office environment. And I was a cross-functional project manager because I'm good at looking at patterns and asking good questions. But what was happening is we were being very under-resourced and being asked to drive through a lot of change. So the same people in our department missed Christmas and New Year's 2 years in a row because we ended up processing the euro, so switching all the currencies. But then Y2K compliance came up, and I left the bank in August '99 because I just had enough. My department had 4 out of 5 managers on what's known as stress leave for months at a time, and I had been out for 1 month on stress. So I took an MBA to relax. And it was actually, I took an MBA, which is a 1-year MBA, which is done by a lot of ex-military guys. So it was sort of the MBA for Marines, but even so, it was still way more relaxing than being at the bank.
Can you remember what was the key message that you learned there at the MBA, or maybe which had an impact on you?
So what was disappointing about the MBA is they were still very much business as usual, wealth extraction, those sorts of things. The thing that was good, though, was it was showing that there are rules and people can decide on those rules. And if you change the rules, you change the behavior, you change the outcomes. And so it was around that time that I also read Images of Organization, and it just dawned on me in a way that feels like embarrassingly naive that I never worked out before, which is we have choice on how to do this stuff. That book, and also just being in the MBA and looking at business, but being outside of it, being able to reflect on it and noticing that there are choices that can make such a huge difference on people's sense of well-being, on the environment, on whatever, so many different factors. It was the first time I realized that we can actually impact the system, that the system isn't like it is, like it doesn't have to be like it is.
It's interesting that you mentioned Images of Organization by Gareth Morgan, and that's the book that you contributed to our reading list. It's interesting because I think I read it at the same time, sometime maybe a bit earlier in the 90s. It was actually one of the first books I read when I got into my profession as a change facilitator. And it still fascinates me. I still have it here with me because what it does, it gives different metaphors for organization. And actually what you just say, depending on which metaphor we keep in mind, we will act and behave differently, isn't it?
Yeah. And there was a few things that really stuck with me. So the one about business is competitive sport. And I remember him saying, like that's where the scorecards and all of that language comes in. And unfortunately, that's also where the morality, particularly in the United States, of if you can get away with it without the ref seeing, go for it. And that was a really profound piece for me of like, oh yeah, that makes total sense. After I graduated from my MBA, went back and worked with a fabulous professor there, and we did some research with alumni of that MBA of which metaphor are they currently experiencing from those 6, and which one would they like to experience.
What was the result?
And the results were, most of them were experiencing business is a competitive sport, and the one that they wanted to experience was business is a living organism. And that was a lovely platform to kind of roll into the thrivability stuff a few years later.
I would like to pick up the thread again and talk about the path of your life. So when did you make the decision to make applied improv as your profession?
I was actually living in the UK, and I did my MBA. I was doing death by PowerPoint for a consultancy that was working with marketing executives, and their whole thing was about marketing excellence. And the thing I loved about the marketing door was that it's holistic, that you can really get almost at anything in the organization through the marketing door. And what I hated was the wealth extraction values. And I don't know if you've ever seen Bill Hicks. He's a famous comedian who passed away in '94, but he had this fantastic bit on if you're in marketing or advertising, kill yourself.
Oh my God.
And it sounds very aggressive, but it was such a wonderful commentary on this is usual wealth extraction capitalism. And so I would be doing these, like merger and acquisition to marketing executives in big pharmas. And I was thinking, and then Bill would pop up in my head and I'm kind of like, not now, Bill. Like, I really need to focus on these 60 slides. And the other thing that for me that triggered the improv was in doing Death by PowerPoint, they also had a simulation. So we had this slide that I called the slide of irony, which was talking about the more interactive learning is, the more powerful it is. But the how wasn't part of the what. So the fact that we were alternating between a simulation where they did not debrief any of the team stuff or even set people up for success in the team stuff. It was all about like how to launch this, fabulous drug or how to market it to different markets and segments. And for me, that was such a waste of genius in the room. Even if it was genius applied to business as usual, it was still, we were working with huge groups of very smart people and it was all basically push. So that was the experience that led me to think I need to flip this learning inside out. And that's when I read another book by Robert Lowe called Improvisation, Inc. And it was all about taking that improv stuff that I had learned earlier for performance and applying it to organizations, to businesses.
In your book, you described this 3.5 months journey, which you did in 2014, in which you visited 12 countries. You talk about a lot of different stuff, and obviously you met a lot of persons. You describe sad, funny, and hilarious situations you got yourself into. You encountered 2 major earthquakes, civil unrest, a sandstorm, financial hardship, the death of 2 people close to you, but you also met a lot of wonderful people. What was the purpose of this journey?
I think I wanted to take life's master course at improvisation. I was totally broke. And I had my return ticket to London, and then all of a sudden projects started lining up going east from London. So I had something in Denmark, and then I talked to a friend in Italy and they said, oh, we can put this together for you. And it just, because I'd been part of the Applied Improvisation Network, I was on the board for 6 years and I'd co-chaired a lot of their global conferences. I knew a lot of people in many different places. So I was able to kind of just make it all the way around the world. So it was kind of out of necessity and kind of providence that I think if you're going to become a master at whatever you do, you need to let life test you to the core. And this journey really tested me. So the original book, the title was called Using Improv to Save the World. And then I added, and me. In parentheses, because it shifted from being kind of a business book to being more of a personal journey life book.
So let's touch upon some of those stories, and maybe we start with what to me sounds the most exotic one, because you visited Iran, and I have no idea how applied improv would look like in Iran. Tell us just a few things that happened to you in Iran.
Sure. So I had a beautiful host who's still a lovely friend named Saleh. So in Iran, they have different rules between men and women. So he was so sweet. I arrived at 3 a.m. in Shiraz airport, and there was this wonderful awkward moment where men and women are not supposed to hug in public, and he knew I was a hugger and he wanted me to feel safe. So we have this like awkward hug at 3 in the morning, and then like it was really like, yeah, like quick. Okay, and then we went into the taxi, and he showed me lots of different places, and he was so beautiful. Like every time he would take me to restaurants, he wouldn't let me pay for anything during my whole trip. He took me out to restaurants, and we would always order 3 things. So whatever I wanted, whatever he wanted, and 1 extra dish so that I could sample all 3 things. Like he really wanted me to experience everything. I had this hilarious thing happen. So he arranged for some workshops and conferences to happen in Tehran. And they were happening at the University of Tehran, so government-owned building. And all morning as we were setting up to be in there, guys were coming in and shaking my hand. And That's just, it was a stream of them. And I think they were trying to just make me feel welcome. And then one guy came in and I grabbed his hand and I started shaking it. And he said, "Oh, I've been sent in here to tell you to stop shaking hands." And he's doing this speech as we're shaking hands. I'm like, "Oh, we should stop doing this then."
Let's slowly move over to talking about the core of applied improv. So rather than to explain it first theoretically, let's just get into improv right away. And I'm a big fan of improv myself, and I use it in some of my workshops. So let's do a game.
Okay.
Belina, let's do a bike ride. I really love bike riding.
Yes, what I like about your idea is it'll help us see the countryside at a slower pace. And we could bring a Frisbee with us.
Yes, what I like about your idea is the Frisbee will give us some additional entertainment once we stop during the trip. And I think we could really go out and visit some nice places out of Berlin.
Yes, what I like about your idea is I haven't seen enough places out of Berlin. And we could go on a treasure hunt for old buildings.
Yes, what I like about your idea, there are so many beautiful old buildings around, for example, in Potsdam, and that would give us a good opportunity to learn more about history.
Yes, what I like about your idea is I want to learn more about history so I can feel more grounded and connected here. And we could also find the best rated restaurant.
Yes, what I like about your idea is that we could have some really great food, after we cycled. I mean, we burned a lot of energy and we could then sit at one of the lakes near Potsdam.
Yes, what I like about your idea is there's something so relaxing about looking at water, and we could go for a boat ride.
So, Belina, what did we just do?
So this is a game which I think is a master game that I learned from a lady named Sue Walden. And it's fantastic for negotiation skills in organizations. It's fantastic for adaptive leadership. It's really splitting your response into two things. One is when you acknowledge the specific thing that you like about somebody's idea, that feels wonderful. And you're also giving them specificity. So even if we can't go with your idea, we can go with something else that fulfills that requirement that you identified. When I play this in groups, a lot of times the language slips. So sometimes they say what I like about the idea instead of your idea. And that sort of takes away the acknowledgement of the person. So we're trying to keep that in. You're also not saying I like the whole idea. You're just being very specific about the thing that you like about it. So again, that could be fulfilled with other things. And then you're moving the story forward together.
And what I really like about is that it excludes the but, because what I experience in my work with organizations and with managers, that people do not refer to the idea of the other person, but usually answer with a yes, but.
Yes. There's a really nice phrase that I heard from Sue. I don't think she originated, but I heard it from her saying, don't put your butt in other people's faces.
What is applied improv? I think a lot of our listeners will know it, but then again, I'm pretty sure there are also some who don't know it. So give us a short summary of what applied improv is about.
It's taking the mindset and practice from an improvisational performance like jazz, or in my case, and in your case as well, performance improv, and it's applying it to non-theatrical application. My favorite model is about what are the core capabilities of improvisation, what are we doing when we improvise, is by a guy named Robert Poynton, and it's a triangle model. And it's at the top, it says let go. On one point, it's notice more, and the other point, it's use everything. And at the core is yes and. And I love this because it's a really elegant way to describe what we're doing. So let go is about letting go of any behavior or thought pattern that isn't serving us in the moment. Notice more is noticing more about yourself, about your colleagues, about potential resources that might be informal or formal that you have access to, and use everything or use more because you've noticed it. The spirit of yes and is really, how can you accept and build on the emerging reality? Sometimes it's mistaught as you have to say yes, which is dangerous in certain circumstances. In theater, that's usually fine because it was designed to help people who are nervous from going negative. So Keith Johnson talked about, like if you have two performers on stage and one of them says, "Here's an apple," and the other one, because they're nervous, goes, "No, it's not." The scene dies very quickly. So yes and was built to say yes, accept and build on the offer. When we apply it to organizations, we have to be very careful, because sometimes the thing that we're saying yes and in is our own doubt of, this doesn't feel right. The invitation is to say yes and accept on external offers more often than we do, because we often say no for safety. And at the same time, it does not mean say yes all the time, if that makes sense. Keith Johnson has a really nice quote. He said, if you say yes but or no but, you are rewarded with safety. But if you say yes and, you're rewarded with an adventure.
And that, of course, for many people is very, very scary.
Sure.
Yeah, I really like this triangle. So notice more, let go, use everything. There's one thing from the applied improv principles, which I also love and which I offer to my participants in the courses, which is let the other shine.
Yeah.
Is that also something you play around with?
Yeah, I do. And it's so nice. It's sort of like, if we all operate from this point of view, we'll all look fabulous, is the thing. It is a lovely one.
What I experience, obviously, with groups, particularly in business organizations, is when I introduce applied improv, there is always a resistance, because particularly if people get a hunch that has to do something with theater, which it has and has not, how do you deal with the resistance of people who are very shy? They don't want to embarrass themselves in public and things like that.
Sure. It really depends on kind of how you come through. So it's getting easier to use improv explicitly. Just because the Applied Improvisation Network has been around for so long, so many people have been using the games, and that's a blessing and a curse, because some people have experienced fabulous facilitation and some people have experienced really crappy facilitation around it.
Right.
But it's kind of known. It's in the big magazines. We actually did a survey several years ago of the Applied Improv Network, and we were in, I think, 15 of the top 20 Ivy League schools doing something explicitly with improvisation. So it's getting more known. In terms of dealing with the people who are more shy, you're trying to invite people. It's, how can we as facilitators make it okay? How can we, first of all, scale it? So if we're doing something, they can see that it's practical. They can see the link to their work. And also the difficulty level is scaled, so you start really gently and simply, and then you move up. I think there's a different sort of school out there of facilitation of throw them in the deep end, and I don't do that, because I think life is hard enough.
So what's your story for corporate clients? Why should businesses use improv for changing their game?
There's a few different things to think about. One is, there's a real world context of access to resources, social equity. There's several things that kind of, on a grand scale, if organizations that are so powerful on earth treated the earth a bit differently, it could make such a massive difference on the big challenges that we're facing. And it can't be sort of greenwashing or, I don't know if you've had this, Holger, but it's sort of, you're brought in for an empowerment, some form of empowerment, but you realize all they wanted the employees to have was kind of a good time, and then to shut up and go back in their boxes.
Absolutely, that happens all the time.
Yeah, so the time for that is over. Like, we don't have time to do that anymore. And I'm not trying to get into the fear space, but it's just in the kind of reality space of, there's so many big challenges on our earth and with our societies at the moment, that feels like such a business as usual feels like a waste of of time, quite frankly. We need to work out how to do this so that it's wealth co-creation, so that there's a real heart connection, and that there's a real yes-anding of what is happening to our earth and what's happening to our society. And that's part of the reason, as we said, it's fractal. So if I'm going in and doing adaptive leadership that might have nothing to do with sustainability or whatever, but just so people can collaborate better and be sort of better at collaborating with their team, that same practice that they're using with the activities will actually help them to be a better spouse at home, but also help them in a situation of unprecedented weather. And I think because it's fractal, so there's only a slight kind of shift that we need to make, which is, okay, so how do we yes and the realities of what's happening to the planet? How do we not shift into fear, but shift into collaboration mode? The whole reason I've gone much more explicitly into sustainability stuff is I saw Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth, and I noticed I wanted to get into a Hummer and go shopping. Like, that was my visceral response from watching his stuff. And my dad called me, he said, "Bean, don't have kids." And I'm like, well, thanks, Al Gore, for that. But it was for me, it was everything Al Gore is saying is really important. And the way he's telling us it makes me go into my lizard brain. And this is at a time when we need to be the most collaborative and generous than we've ever been. And improv was designed for that. Improv is designed to help people who are afraid on stage to be present, connected, and generous. And in my book, I talk about it's actually a secret love technology.
I love that.
So that's why I think organizations need to embrace it.
You use the word thrivability a lot. What's thrivability?
Yeah, so thrivability is looking at how nature and people thrive and applying that to organizations.
How would you apply that to organizations?
So there are certain principles that help things like forests to thrive. So having a cohesive whole, having diverse parts, having dynamic relationships, and you can overlay that to organizations to notice things like how do you train people? What's the vision driving the company? Forests do not need visions because life is their sort of vision, but because organizations are man-made, that's kind of the one that is that we need to add. What's the vision? It's also forests have certain characteristics that there's a nurturing aspect. So certain trees, mycelium moves nutrients around a forest. In organizations, you can find individuals and roles that move nutrients around, for example, stewards. So what happens if we invite those stewards to really think what would be different in your organization if you really wanted life to thrive on the planet? How would this organization look different? How would the products be different? There was this magical man in Montreal named Tolu who set up a cleaning company just to help fund being in Montreal doing his MBA. And then he realized that there was a real kind of spiritual practice connected with cleaning. And he used all environmentally friendly products just because he didn't want to poison himself initially and his wife because they weren't sure what they were doing. But then he realized that if you clean the space, there's something about cleaning the energy. And he created a program where he had CEOs apprentice with his cleaners for 3 days just to notice what came up for them in terms of change of status, in terms of caring for others, in terms of connection with space. And for me, he was he unfortunately passed away last year, but he was a really shining example of an organization that is going towards thrivability, that is trying to pull that in terms of kind of what is your product or service? How do you really make that support life and keep working on it so that it's even more and more beautiful as time goes on? His whole mission was to clean what cleaning means.
I think it's time for another game. And we talked before about your latest journey, which brought you to Australia, where you visited and participated in a big sustainability conference. And what you told me is that you met a lot of angry people there. What happened?
I think Australia has had a lot of setbacks politically. The fact that a lot of the people in power are still very pro-coal, connecting at the same time with Australia really having massive temperature shifts. So when I was there, it was 44 degrees during the day and then 16 at night because it had rained. Melbourne usually has variable temperature, but that swing was very unusual. They were having massive floods in the north that killed a bunch of cattle and horses and drowned them. And in the south, in Tasmania, a lot of the ancient pristine forests were burned just to the ground. So they're feeling it. And I've been doing something called sustainable stand-up there for a few years now. And for me, what I'm trying to do is help empower people who are trying to make the world a better place to use a really compassionate form of humor to articulate what's important to them. So it is how do we bring lightness? How do we bring humanity and empathy? So I went there to deliver for those shows, but also to give a talk, which is, how do we use the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross grief curve and not message from anger, but message from experimentation. Because I think I told you my experience of a lot of sustainability people, particularly early on, we are angry and furious, and the people who are ignorant are in denial. And if you get woke and understand what's really happening to the earth, you can be as angry as we are. And for me, that's, yes, of course, what's happening to the earth can make people angry, but messaging from that space is not an invitation that most people would want to take up. So if you can do your own individual process of going through your anger and transmuting some of it and getting to the space of experimentation, moving forward, that's a much stronger place to message from, to get people to take on board some of these big ideas.
Let's demonstrate that in a game. I would start. Belina, what really upsets me is car drivers. I'm riding my bike, and what I experience is so much ruthlessness. They honk their horns, they override me with just a little distance to my bike, they shout at me, and all this kind of things. And particularly in Berlin, and even worse around Berlin, car drivers are so ruthless. They're violent. I mean, there have been many deadly accidents with cyclists. So I'm really, they really piss me off, these car drivers.
Thank you so much for that. So based on what you said, here's what I think you care about. Kindness is definitely in there, kindness and safety. And particularly that it's Berlin, it's your home city. So there's something about wanting your home to be a safe space, and possibly also understanding, like having drivers that really understand what it's like from the cyclist perspective. So those are just a few things that I picked out. How do those resonate with you?
Oh, absolutely. Berlin people are really known to be very polite and rough. I mean, there's a nice core, obviously, in everybody, but the spirit of the town and also of the surrounding is really very, very ruthless. And I would really like to be my city and the people here, and in general, people more kind. So the kindness thing really resonated with me.
Nice. So yeah, I love this activity. I think it's such a seemingly indirect way at getting what people want, what people value, but it's so powerful. When people are angry, like especially if you stoke up that anger, to be told it takes a lot of energy for us to be angry, and it's also often not socially acceptable. So one of the things we do with our anger is we turn it inside and it becomes depression, which is not great for us. If we can greet people who are angry with this lens of listening for what's the beauty in them, it tends to take the fire out, and it also helps to identify a way forward that's really positive. So I've played this in many realms, in negotiation and also in sustainable stand-up, when we're trying to have people speak their truth. Like, what's the one conversation you'd like to have with the world through your comedy right now based on what's going on? It's kind of indirect and lovely route to get there. Because when we're communicating, it's like, okay, how can you communicate? Holger, if you were going to do a presentation on cycling in Berlin, right? You could either share with the audience what pisses you off, or you can look for how do you show what kindness, what safety, what home and understanding would look like. And for me, that's a much more engaging place to communicate from. And that's what I'm trying to help people who are trying to change the world and make it better, to communicate from that space of what do we want, what's the beautiful thing we care about, versus all of the things that are pissing us off. Because we're sort of basked in anger, in the news, in different places all the time. And it's really refreshing to have somebody come from a very steady, positive place that is connecting with the thing you care about.
In an article of yours, you touched the subject of mastery. Tell me, how you are trying to achieve mastery? And I'm saying trying to achieve, knowing that you're already a master. And then I believe it's a life struggle for all of us that never ends, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. It depends on the day. Sometimes I'm feeling more masterful than others. I think it's how do we be true to ourselves? The improv, being self-employed is never a steady performance, and sometimes it's fabulous and things are going well, and sometimes it's a little bumpy. And I think it's trying to touch back into what I find in my life is whenever I'm having a bumpy time, it's usually I'm getting caught up on not doing something that I've taught other people, if that makes sense. And I think it's noticing that, laughing at that, and just accepting and embracing that is part of the continual journey of mastery. I'll give you a concrete example of that. So I was broke in Montreal, right? And I had to leave the country, and I wanted to do this trip. But in order to do the trip, I needed to write and post a fundraising campaign, which I'd never done before. So I'm sitting in a cafe in Montreal, staring at this thing, going, like, I don't know how to write this thing. And a student of mine from an applied improv workshop walks in and sits down. He's like, "What's wrong?" And I tell him, and he's like, "Well, why don't you just do a shitty version like you told us to do?" As the first draft. And I'm like, oh my God, that's so smart. So, and I did that, and then I got help with it, and then it was able to raise £7,000 in 2 weeks. Yeah, I think, also the older I get, I don't know if this is happening with you as well, is how to be more gentle and loving with myself. And I think that allows for mastery too.
I have a list with 70 questions in front of me, and of course you don't know them. I want you to give me a number between 1 and 70, and I will ask you the question.
3.
Oh yeah, we never had that question before in our show, so that's good, and it fits very well to what we just said. What skill would you like to master?
Financial planning. Probably.
Because?
I think that would be a good one. Because I moved to Germany in part to give myself more structure, because I am an improviser, and I needed to, after that trip, and I needed to kind of lean the other way. And financial planning would just give me a little bit more breathing room sometimes.
Music. We have a Spotify playlist, which our users can find when they go to our website, which is changedays.com/podcast. And we ask our guests to contribute 3 songs which have a certain meaning for them. Belina, you contributed What's Up from Four Non-Blondes, Beauty in the World by Macy Gray, and Let It Be by the Beatles. Talk about one song, one of the 3, and why it's important for you.
Beauty in the World was kind of my theme song for the trip, for the Using Improv to Save the World trip. There's something about how joyful she is, and she's also at some point acknowledging that the weather's going to change and that things are beautiful now, so be present with the beauty that's here. And I really love this idea. I think about it often, especially when people are kind of making themselves miserable about, you know, the shifts that are probably coming with, you know, temperature and everything else. It's like, but if you're caught in that all the time, you're really missing what a gorgeous, beautiful blue sky day today is, for example.
Last year, you facilitated a workshop at the Berlin Change Days. What is your Change Days experience, and what would you say, what makes that event special?
Well, the founder is awesome. Thank you. You're welcome. It's a really magical space. You know, it's not often that you, there were such diverse people in the room who all have this real passion to create change and organizational change, and such a wealth of experience. They're willing to be playful. They're willing to try new things and to laugh and to cry and to really put themselves on an edge. Like the fact that we all kind of went out into the street and did different things to engage with people was really an interesting and exciting invitation as part of an event. So yeah, I loved it. I thought it was great.
Belina Raffy, as I expected, this was a wonderful conversation which we could continue for hours, and maybe we have a second episode in a few months to come. Thank you so much for being here with me. I really, really enjoyed the conversation.
Holger, thank you. This was really delightful. Thank you very much.